Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar, Unlocking the Business of Sustainability Through Tokenization. I think it's about time that we get started. First off, let me introduce myself. My name is Paul DiMarzio. I'm part of the management staff at the InterWork Alliance, and it's only by true irony that I'm here today. Marley Gray of Microsoft was going to lead this conference and talk through the Microsoft point of view. But he is suffering a climate event right now. He lives in coastal Alabama, and as you may be aware, Hurricane Sally has just taken its toll on that area of the country. So he's out of power. He did get to us. He's safe. His family is safe. They only suffered minimal damage personally, but he can't get any power, and he can't get out to find any place to hook up. So. Darko Pilav, one of our panelists, is going to step in and take over Marley's spot. So, it just kind of reiterates the importance of this topic. I myself, I live in New England, and it was just this time last month that Hurricane Isaias ravaged my area and put us out of power for a couple of weeks and made it impossible to move. And, if you look at the news today, you see that most of the West Coast of the United States is burning. Europe has had tremendous heat waves and floods. It goes all around the world. So wherever you're from, you are suffering from this concept. So it's absolutely imperative that we find a way to come together, as a bunch of teams and get this problem solved. So I'm joined today by some great folks from that are working on this problem with us. Marley, of course, who cannot be here. From Microsoft is helping to lead the overall IWA, and also, this is an important topic to Microsoft as a carbon producer to get this squared away. John Lee of Accenture is with me. Darko Pilav, as I mentioned, from Digital Asset, will do his own part as well as Marley's part, and Cameron Prell of Xpansiv are all here to talk through, what's going on, with us in the IWA and this topic. So we're going to do this in a couple of sections. Darko is going to go through the opportunity space that we're looking at, as well as the forum that we're providing for having this taken care of. Then John's going to come on and talk about how we collaborate as a team to come to solutions. Cameron's going to explain how we're going to actually drive that collaboration to results, and then Darko is going to come back and show how, as an organization, we're going to collect, organize, and execute against the work that's being done. We expect to have about 10 minutes to answer questions and answers. Since there's so many folks on the call, we can't do open mics, but you'll see in your Zoom screen an area for Q&A. If you go into the Q&A section and type in your questions there, we'll either answer them as the webinar is going on, or we'll take the time at the end to go through these verbally. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Darko to talk through the material.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I would like to thank all of you for joining this webinar about the IWA Sustainability Business Working Group. And I'm hoping I'll be able to fill Marley's shoes somewhat. So starting immediately with the next slide, what is the opportunity that lies in front of us? Now, looking at the members of the IWA, and particularly the Sustainability Business Working Group in our case, we really have both the possibility as well as the need to shape how various areas of the sustainability markets are going to function. And this shaping would include the purpose of that particular market, how participants would be interacting, how data is structured, how data is being shared, and various things around that. Now, of course, the requirements for such definitions need to come from many different types of sources. And we are going to use the voluntary carbon market focus area as an example throughout this presentation. So in this particular subtopic that we would be focusing on, this would include on the first hand, the buy side, kind of the demand side, the consumers of carbon offsets. There, we would need to make sure that we understand how the consumers would best express their demand, express their aspirations, and understand what exactly that they would need in order to be able to trust such products that they would be buying. Then, of course, we also need to interact with the suppliers. The suppliers also need to know, or the requirement we would get from the suppliers would be what is the information that they need in order to shape their products? What is the expected trajectory of the demand, etc., that they can create products that they would be able to sell further down the line. Now, of course, a very important piece of the puzzle lies with the verifiers. And with them, we would be capturing all fields and properties, all the details, such that the veracity of the products can be guaranteed. Because in the end, without the trust that such a product that can be bought is not forged, that it's really what it is on the covers. This is really required in order for such a market to work. Now, with the providers and the demand side captured, the supply captured, and with everything in place in order for everyone to rely on the data that is there and making sure that being able to trust that the products are true. We also need to make sure that that all these products can be traded and financed and so on. And this is where the investors and exchanges are coming into play. And they would be providing all their know-how and all their requirements so that everything is in place that the products can be used on the market, as I said, being traded, financed, insured, etc. Now, going to the next slide, we can say that the IWA in general, and again, particularly in the case of the Sustainability Business Working Group, provide the perfect forum for such an endeavor. So it brings people together from a broad number of industries, and each person that is participating there brings their own subject matter expertise. And such a breadth enables us to share and capture and understand all the requirements that are needed, and we can define the specifications, etc., such that a standard that we be defining really can work and can be adopted. Now, one point too I'd like to emphasize is this is a business working group, not a technical working group. So this means that the work that we are going to be doing and the results that are coming out of it would be implementation neutral. So what we are focusing on is providing detailed requirements for the digitization or tokenization of the offsets, modeling of the entities, the workflows, and so on. But what we're not going to do is prescribe exactly how the implementation is supposed to look like. This is where then the technical working groups of the IWA would come into play, and we would be handing over our specifications and requirements to them, and they would be working out how exactly the technical implementation of that could look like. So how are we going to achieve all of this? On the next slide, please. Again, we are going to keep using the example of the voluntary carbon market. And in order to be successful there, we need the following foundation. So first of all, we need to make sure that we speak the same language. So this would mean we would need to agree to common terms, abbreviations, and so on. We would need to form a glossary just to make sure, because in the end, speaking the same language is kind of the founding brick of a standard, right? Now, once we have such a glossary, we would need also to define a categorization scheme for all these terms. Because in the end, what we need to do is we need to kind of bring structure into the space in all dimensions. And this would be done with such a categorization scheme. And of course, once we have such a categorization scheme and we apply it to all the terms that we have, we would have a structure, and we would need to understand the relationship between the different parts of that structure. So how are we tackling this entire problem? How do we really want to gather these three points? So the initial point where we would start is collecting materials that the various members and member institutions have produced kind of in a potluck fashion. So this would then end up in a sizable amount of material. And once we have that pool of material, we would start classifying the material and the terms and creating that structure. Now, of course, at the same time, we are going to be refining the classification scheme such that, as I said, the entire, that we can create a structure of all those for these contributions. And one thing one could envision is that this could look like a tree-like structure of those contributions. Now, once we have such a tree-like structure, the subject matter experts would be within the group, would then work through the different pools, the different clusters of these classifications to resolve duplications, conflicts, and very importantly, identify areas that are still not really well covered. And such areas that are not yet really well covered, these kind of blind spots, are kind of indicating that, well, it needs to be further developed, this particular area, either with the know-how that we have in the group, or if we don't have that know-how in the group, if those specific subject matter experts are missing, we would try to recruit new members so that these gaps can be filled. And then finally, once these classification pools are combed out, they can be used as a basis to defining this particular class with all their properties and requirements, etc. Now, out of this particular last step that I said, kind of defining all the properties and requirements of that class, a draft of artifacts would emerge. And this effort would be driven by the focus team. Again, in our example, the voluntary carbon market subteam. And on the next slide, you can see how such a classification tree could look like. It's a little bit lagging with me right now, but it's going to update in a second. So in that classification tree here, you would see kind of how these very, very broad terms, this is just kind of for visualization purposes, how this would pan out, and then how such a sub-team would focus on a particular subset, on a particular branch, so to say, and then work on that according to this process that I mentioned before. So this is kind of in general the opportunity that we see and how exactly we would be tackling this challenge. Next, John Lee is going to talk about the perspective from the investor's side and the buy side in general. John, over to you.
Thanks, Darko. Hello, everyone. My name is John Lee, and I'm the capability lead for capital markets and exchanges here at Accenture. And I'm part of the global team that's looking into things like tokenization and how the typical message-based business model can be I'll say, changed or innovated against using emerging technology like blockchain. If I could go to the next slide. So the first thing that I did want to talk about is the investment behavior is starting to really reach an inflection point between buy-side institutions and sell-side organizations. And what you're starting to see is this big pivot to move away from what I'll call brown or dirty type of investments, and it's trying to move to something that's a little bit more sustainable. The main key driver there is the fact that some of these firms that have obligations over the next 30 to 40 years and a lot of their portfolio holdings, they've started to realize that if you don't take ESG metrics into account, that some of their risk curves and their risk profiles are slightly flawed. And so what you're starting to see is that demand to really look at how you can take some of these metrics and take them into consideration. And this is something that's not necessarily new. It's been something that's been developing over the last 10 to 15 years, but it's really started to reach an inflection point over the last couple of years, simply because people are starting to see the effects of climate change. And obviously with Marley not being able to attend, it's front and center right now. And so large organizations, and these are just some of the examples that we have on the left-hand side, are really starting to make some very bold and public statements around ESG and the fact that they've realized that sustainable investing is something that really needs to be taken into consideration for everyone's portfolio. So when we look at that, people wanted to understand, well, what's in it for me? What's in it for the investor? And we took a look at it, and basically there were three areas from an investor's perspective that would be beneficial when you start looking at sustainability as a metric that could be included into their investment decisions. Obviously, the first one, when you think about investment diversification across new and emergent industries, this is something that you want to incorporate into your portfolio. And as the technology is starting to catch up with some of the demands that are required out there, you're starting to see that there are some very, very lucrative investment options that you do need to take into consideration. The second one around risk management. Now, this is the one that I kind of just mentioned earlier. When you think about a long-term holding, for example, some of these organizations, like the coal industry as an example, undergo some massive transformation because of what the disintermediation or evolution of the markets have taken place. And they've realized that ESG metrics can help kind of gauge what that would look like over a 40-year risk curve, for example. So these long-term obligations, let's say, for example, like to a pension fund where they need to meet their payment obligations to their pensioners, they are realizing that they need to incorporate this now. So a lot of their holdings that they have are going to be in a position to still provide yield when the pensioners need it. And this is really more reflective of the current environment and just the awareness across the broader organizations and the communities that without this, everything that you have from a forecasting perspective is flawed, and you're missing a few things. And of course, that in turn leads to better portfolio performance. One of the metrics that we've been looking at from a research perspective is that we can start to see very early on that the total return to shareholders is actually 1.5 times that of companies that are not taking ESG into their operating agenda. So there is money to be made here. There is revenue to be made while doing something good for the environment. Now, that's on the investor side, but if you take a look at the companies, and how the companies can actually position themselves so that they can be green or greener to ensure that the investors will continue to stay interested in them. You think about branding and reputation, and it's starting to really make significant changes in buying behaviors. And if you think about the retail public, a lot of what's happening with GHG emissions and climate change as a whole, you're starting to see that this is actually making an impact on the environment. So people are starting to decide, if there isn't any type of reporting or disclosure whatsoever, I'm not so sure I want to continue to buy your products. And that is something that is starting to move forward. And really, from a company perspective, you want to make sure that you put your best foot forward to ensure that your market capitalization stays where it is or grows. Now, the second piece, when you think about the business and the external reporting standards, you have to say to yourself, well, how am I going to actually do this? And so what you're starting to see is reporting standards that are coming out there to say this is sort of how you can structure what some of the key metrics are that you can report. Now, obviously, some of the challenges that we're starting to experience is that how can you actually validate and prove that what you're reporting is actually correct? And there is a traceability element or challenge around how you can prove that what you're reporting can actually be, traced all the way back to, either carbon offset avoidance or actually purchasing a carbon credit that can be, traced back from a provenance standpoint. These are some of the challenges that the industry is facing right now. And I'll get back to that in a second in terms of how we're starting to see emerging technology like blockchain starting to look at how to address that. Now, when you think about lower cost of capital, the other thing that we found in research was that operating margins are now starting to show almost 4 times improvement for organizations that have started to take ESG metrics into consideration. And that's a massive number. And what we're forecasting is that number is only going to increase. The last one, obviously, we can't eliminate or not talk about the regulatory environment. If you see things like the Paris Agreement, where the companies and the governments of the world have realized that this is a global problem, a global issue, and that they're trying to really push forward on a regulatory agenda, that these are some of the things that you need to take into account in order to do good for the planet, but at the same time continue to be profitable as an operating company. So these are some of the things that when you think of as a company, you want to make sure that the regulatory landscape, as it evolves and changes, you're still in a position to operate and function and not potentially get shut down. Next slide. So when you think about, some of the issues and challenges around how you can actually validate that what you're buying, and we are talking about, a carbon offset or a carbon token, you want to make sure that the product that you're buying, validates that what it is that you have can be traced back to, a tree plant or something that is actually removing GHG emissions from the atmosphere. And some of the things that we've realized when you look at blockchain technology and some of the traits as we've outlined here on the left-hand side, these are some of the things that you can start to see how blockchain is starting to enable the development of an ecosystem. And so when you think of the capabilities that are starting to happen from a sustainability standpoint, it's starting to manifest itself across multiple areas. You think of carbon, GHG emissions is the one that obviously takes front and center, but other things like water, agriculture, waste and energy, and how you can move forward to be more clean in terms of how you could measure the energy consumption, the energy usage with renewable energy sources is quite a challenge. And when you look at the technology that existed 10 years ago, to actually look at the provenance and the actual authenticity of some of these elements, it was very, very hard to do. And one of the things that we're starting to see now is that the enablement of blockchain technology and the tokenization elements is starting to look at addressing some of these massive problems. Next slide, Paul. So what does that mean from a capital markets ecosystem? Obviously the first one that we were looking at was centered around carbon and carbon credits. Oh, my animations are not working. Oh, never mind, there it is. So you think of, carbon credits and how that can actually move forward. Obviously, one of the biggest challenges with carbon credits right now is how can you actually match the demand, which is spiking with all of these companies making very, very long-term 10-year commitments, and starting to look at how you could develop, validated and I'll call it auditable and traceable supply. This is some of the things that the IWA and the token standards are looking to try and solve. But that's just the beginning. When you think about the emergent asset classes that you can trade within you know, a capital markets ecosystem, carbon credits would just be the beginning. You can start looking at things like renewable energy credits as well, how you can actually start to bring that into a secondary market and start to look at trading these elements for those that want to kind of improve their ESG score. But it doesn't stop there. On parallel threads, you can start to see the proliferation of green bonds. And if you think about green bond subscription rates, a lot of these things get sold out and get oversubscribed, even without validating that what you're buying is in fact green. And so a lot of the elements of what the DLT solution can actually bring to some of these emergent asset classes can really go back to the traceability and provenance of the actual holdings. And of course, finally, you can ultimately look at future cash flows and you can start to securitize some of these things with a lot of the electricity sales and contracts. And you can start to look at more complex financial instruments. And this is one of the things that tokenization could start to enable. And if we think about the emergent asset classes that are developing within that cap markets ecosystem, you could start to see some of these in some permutations starting to gain a lot of traction between the buy side and the sell side community. Next slide, Paul. So, you know, the nice tagline, but at the end of the day, one of the things that we wanted to make sure was that this is no longer about trying to reduce your carbon footprint or trying to do less harm. It's really about trying to, you know, knock it out of the park and doing more good. And so a lot of the organizations that have made very public announcements, which is great, is further investment into not only being carbon neutral, but starting to be carbon negative. And hopefully by doing that, there is a lot about how you can start to protect and save the environment, but at the same time, look at new capital structures and investment opportunities that would allow these organizations and companies to flourish. And with that, I will pass it over to Cameron to give us a little bit more detail on some of the carbon markets.
No, that's great. No, it's a great introduction, and thanks to everybody for participating, and glad to be a part of this sustainability working group with IWA. So my name's Cameron Prell. I'm the head of government policy and legal for an entity known as Xpansiv. The full name is Xpansiv CBL Holding Group or Exchange, and we operate under one of our subsidiaries, CBL Markets, one of the largest global spot exchange for voluntary carbon credits. We also, through the subsidiary directly known as Xpansiv, are working with a full ecosystem to really define ESG and climate-related products that have tangible, traceable value that are standardized enough to be tradable and retirement. And so that's an introduction, and glad to answer any questions there. But for purposes here, building on what John was just saying, what we're talking about in the context of this working group is in using voluntary carbon offsets as a first kind of a product category or asset class is the defined exchange of value. And in that regard, like specifically, we're talking about an intangible asset that is defined by the participants themselves. And so I wanted to have a conversation here about what the intention of this working group is and why it's so valuable of an opportunity to bring what we call collaborative governance to bear to really define the asset classes and to define the value proposition for the ultimate intangible assets that are going to be transacted. And so to further on what John was saying, at the company level, for over the past 20 years, that we've seen an evolution of starting with the basic mapping my carbon footprint to defining scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions in terms of that company's kind of profile from a greenhouse gas perspective. And then really understanding that from a greenhouse gas perspective, not all carbon is created equal. And what I mean by that is that a voluntary carbon offset credit ostensibly represents 1 ton CO2 equivalent reduced or avoided that is then tradable and fungible with any other 1 ton of CO2 equivalent in that regard. But that's not realistically how voluntary markets have evolved. And the reason for that is that a ton of CO2 removed from one type of offset project might be very different from another type of offset project that are both verified and generating and issuing credible offsets, but the end buyer that has a carbon profile that they are seeking to either offset, mitigate, manage their profile, or achieve some goal with their net zero or sustainability commitments, they are interested not just in the ability to purchase and claim the asset itself, the 1 ton CO2 removed, but they're also ostensibly want to assert a property right claim to the co-benefits, the story of how that offset came into being. And so I lead with that because, like, ostensibly what we're talking about here is harmonizing or connecting two worlds that are in kind of convergence. I don't want to say collision, but I want to say convergence. And so what we've got right now over the period of time we have a suite of very credible voluntary offset standards and standards bodies that exist globally, and those standards are broken down by offset type. An offset type could range from a biogas digester that removes the methane that would otherwise be emitted into the air from a landfill gas facility or a pig farm over here. And then there's another offset type that is related to sustainable forestry. And there's another offset type related to potentially reductions of HCFCs. Those different offset types ultimately as a project are separate and apart from the company that seeks to buy those offset credits. And this is a key component, is that we've got hundreds of carbon offsets, excuse me, hundreds is probably hyperbole. We've got dozens of types of carbon offsets, hundreds of project developers and multiple competing standards with differing levels of transparency. The GHG reductions are credible and real, and that this is the great benefit and the excitement around DLT and the ability of blockchain to provide a level of trust that has historically been either perceived or lacking in the voluntary emission carbon space, just because it's been difficult to effectively create that direct chain from project to end use consumer. From a scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 perspective, we have to understand that mapping from a carbon accounting at the company level, an offset is kind of separate and apart from that. You're effectively buying it to apply it either to your own profile, or alternately you're just buying the offsets to claim as receipts that you are financing carbon reducing activities outside of your corporate footprint. But the point there is that value is subjective, right? The companies are purchasing these things not so much for the steak, but for the sizzle. And in that regard, the goal here, if we can move to the next slide, is to understand that at the buy side level, when it comes to climate reporting and ESG related reporting, they're mapping to effectively a future idea that they have a carbon balance sheet of some sort, a sustainability balance sheet, where they're managing their assets and their enterprise on the basis of their environmental performance. And in that regard, that entire taxonomy taxonomy, a brown to green taxonomy, is sector and company specific. Activities, a company might be extremely carbon intensive, but also might have tremendous sustainability activities. And then the same company with a similar profile might have very, very brown activities that gives it a higher climate risk profile. And so from an ESG performance, you have the evolution of a nascent ESG carbon accounting system that is born of that scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, that is top-down, portfolio level, that includes currently a number of qualitative and subjective judgments that a company can make. And it's balkanized, and there are several very prominent initiatives to harmonize those efforts that will be noted as part of this working group. But wanted to get that understanding here that that's on one side of the supply chain. Now let's move to the right-hand side, to the other side of the supply chain, which is carbon accounting. And carbon accounting is a bottoms-up quantitative measurement such that the activities at an offset project site are measurable, reportable, and verifiable to the end goal of generating one CO2e emission reduction achieved. Then that asset is issued into traditionally a centralized registry that is in the form of an intangible asset that has its own serial number. And that serial number is then transacted and purchased downstream by a company that is seeking to achieve their net zero and sustainability goals. Well, in this context, if I'm a company and want to go out and buy offsets, I'm doing so either to go carbon negative, as John was mentioning, or to argue I'm financing emission reduction activities. But in either event, I'm obtaining as part of that purchase the property right to that specific environmental performance that offset project is generating. And this is critical if we move to the next slide to understand that there are so many different types of offset projects in a quantitative carbon accounting regime built around MRV, where DLT blockchain and the ability to source traceable data in real time is a huge innovation, but it's born of providing trust to a marketplace that is currently balkanized in terms of the definition of the value proposition. And so this effort here is largely to bring together every step in the supply chain, from the creation of an offset, the development of an offset project, creation of an offset unit, and then the ultimate retirement and purchase by a company, such that they're able to manage their carbon portfolio using offsets in part, using a common lexicon and common understanding, with the idea that the intangible asset, the token and or the voluntary offset being consumed has a standardized definition, is within a defined asset class, delivers a known set of measurable, reportable, and verifiable information that may or may not fit into different categories of voluntary offsets. And so in that regard, moving to the next slide, what we envision as Xpansiv is that as this kind of awakening that John was mentioning takes place, is that companies will be measuring and reporting their ESG performance up to their investors on the basis of their measurable and quantitative carbon related performance. And offsets is one piece of that puzzle, but before we get to a standardized definition of what a carbon offset is, we need to map at the attribute level, almost like from a genome perspective, what it is that's being done at the offset level, what's being contained within the token from a value proposition, and what it means in terms of delivering that traceability and that auditability to the end use consumer, with the understanding that they are then going to use that information and apply it within the constructs of their carbon accounting regime, their balance sheet, if you will, towards net zero or their sustainability goals. And so with that, I'll move it back to Darko.
Thank you very much, Cameron. So finally, what I want to talk about now is how exactly we are going to be organized and what then our next steps are going to be before we go into the Q&A section of this webinar or this panel. Now, going into the next slide, of course, the entire sustainability space is enormous, and we plan to apply the divide and conquer strategy to tackle all this work. So this means that we will be forming a number of different focus area teams, and those teams will then predominantly work on the particular topics they are assigned to. Now, we have been using the voluntary carbon market team as an example throughout this webinar. The definition of the focus areas that we'll create is going to be driven by the members of the business working group themselves. So this means when a critical mass of members is of the opinion that we should create a new focus team to tackle a specific topic, we will then, of course, do so. Now, once such focus teams have been created, they will define their own meeting cadence and organize themselves such that they can work effectively. So we're not going to prescribe in detail how they should be operating. And then the business working group itself, the larger entity. So the group as a whole is going to meet on a monthly basis. In those monthly meetings, the focus group will be reporting their progress, present their proposals, etc. Then furthermore, the contributions of additional new contributions of the members can be discussed and presented, or for example, new focus areas and focus teams can be proposed and formed. All the materials like meeting announcements, sign-ups, etc., are going to be provided directly to the AWA members. Talking about the next steps on the next slide, the kickoff meeting for the Sustainability Business Working Group is going to be held on October 1st. That should be in 2 weeks precisely. And there we would be going through all the steps that we have mentioned in the beginning, where the definition and the formation of the focus groups would be done, the agreement on the glossary would be kicked off, etc., etc., etc. And then in the end, collecting the requirements, defining the specifications, and once the specifications are there, they would be handled over to the technical working groups. And just as an example, how this can work is using the IWA token taxonomy framework, where, for example, a carbon emission token draft has been created and is being worked on. So this is kind of the outlook of what is going to be happening next and how exactly we are going to tackle this. Right now, I would like to open up for the Q&A section so that you can get your questions answered. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Darko, John, Cameron. Great sessions. We really appreciate the information you've given. As I mentioned, if you have a question, please go to the Q&A and ask it. We've already answered a few on the fly, but I think what I'll do now is I'll just ask all of the panelists to open up your mics, and there are a few that haven't been answered yet. And while I'm getting ready to there, I'm just going to end on this slide. If you want to learn more about the InterWork Alliance, go to our website, please. There's lots of information out there about what we're doing. You can email us at info@, or if you are super excited by this work and are ready to join, send a quick note to membership app. Got a question here directly for Cameron. So I guess we'll throw the mic over to you. Are you creating a commoditized carbon credit token which meets the requirements of Paris, perhaps standardized at a host country level? i.e. under which multiple standards and types could fit? If so, are you partnering with host country governments to do so?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. That's ultimately like where we see the market going. Yes, and so we view ourselves as two ends, bookends of the market for carbon credits. And the first end is the registry, right? And so we view in any classification or asset class definition of what a carbon reduction is, what it means, what standards it meets, and what certifications it achieves vis-a-vis compliance and voluntary concerns. Those are the initial kind of threshold, kind of what we would consider product specifications, right? For the digital asset itself. The next stage is for it to be considered a intangible asset, it needs to be registered somewhere, largely because of putting a stake in the ground, such that unit, however is defined, is not double counted across the marketplace, right? It is cemented in ground, registered as a registered asset. And so on the expansive side, we do view ourselves ultimately as a meta registry for ESG and climate related products, carbon most notably, to the person's question. And going forward, like we intend to become, yes, that point of liquidity for the transactability of those products, those assets, with the understanding that the registry itself is a decision useful management tool for companies, such that as they're registering their assets in an ESG, environmental performance context, they are able to see and manage those assets based on its market value and or internal determined climate value. And so, yes, we are intending to move in that direction. And with DLT and blockchain, we intend to be interoperable in that regard, moving towards the idea that we become the point of liquidity marketplace, the central platform for the spot market, and ultimately the climate risk management that companies endeavor upon. So sorry for the advertisement, but that's what we're doing.
Well, it was a long question. That was a good answer. Thanks, Cameron. Does anybody know the answer to the next question is how we're working to incorporate, articulate, or relate to the 17 UN SDGs, I guess, that are also attacking this problem?
I can take that one real briefly. The SDGs and or things like the aviation sector's move towards what's called CORSIA, which is the emission reductions for the aviation sector, plus a number of well-meaning initiatives around Paris at the country level and in the voluntary market space, are all gravitating towards a same kind of standards system that are all well-meaning. What we're intending to do with IWA is not necessarily replicate and create a new framework. It's more to coalesce around the common threads, the common definitions, the common language, the common taxonomies, such that ultimately the SDG approach, for example, would be one label that a product, a unit, a token meets the threshold for SDGs amongst other possible standards. It's not that we're trying to replicate what they're doing. If that answered your question.
Great, thanks, Cameron. I'm seeing a couple questions of how folks can participate and at what level. All of this work is being done by members of the InterWork Alliance. So you do need to join the InterWork Alliance to participate directly. And yes, even startups can be members. We've set up the structuring so that startups get a benefit. And in fact, I'd say a good third or so of our members, maybe even more, are in that level. So we very much embrace bringing startups in and participating. So if you want more information about that, you can find it directly on the website, or you can send an email to membership@interwork.org. But you definitely do need to be a member to participate. So let's see, what is the relationship with established players in ESG reporting, for example, CDP and GHG protocol? Who's got a good feel for that one?
I can take that. The CDP and GHG protocol. So for everybody participating, the GHG protocol is largely from the International Standards Organization and a multilateral NGO. It is effectively the central starting point for what we were talking about: Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. CDP is a not-for-profit, they originally called the Climate Disclosure Program project that really assisted companies in their ESG disclosures, their initial reporting on that basis, and continues to this day. And this is in terms of participation. Yes, we intend to include and welcome with open arms the ESG reporting community to this discussion, because it's vital. What we're trying to do is connect the dots from the bottoms up, the carbon accounting on voluntary offsets, to the end ESG reporting disclosure, and using that kind of GHG protocol as a base foundation for that brown to green taxonomy.
Great, thanks, Cameron. And if you or somebody else could kind of expand, we're also being asked what we're doing with the Global Emissions Offset, or GEO.
This is where I'm going to step back, but the GEO, the Global Emission Offset, is a new contract that is launched by exchange affiliate CBO markets, and that standard contract is effectively a basket of credit-worthy, credible, verifiable offsets that meet the criteria of the International Civil Aviation Organization's CORSIA program, and so it intends to do as a non-DLT first move, a standardized definition for what is a credible offset in the marketplace.
Great, thanks, Cameron. One last question that's open is the output of the token model going to be public or available to members only? And I'll answer this one. What we're doing is, so to actually participate and build the model, you must be a member, but at some point, we will be making both our models and our tooling available for educational purposes to the public domain. We haven't quite worked out how we're going to make that happen yet, but there will be something released in that vein. You know, one thing we haven't talked about here on this webinar is the fact that part of the mission of the IWA is not just to build the standards, but also to certify products against those standards, to create a level of trust and confidence in what's coming out in the general market. So in order to actually get your products, if you build products on these models, to get them certified, you will have to be a member. But in order to see what we're doing, we are going to expose a lot of that information. We just haven't quite closed on the actual format for that. So just keep an eye on the website, and we'll make that information available as we settle it out. That is the last of the open questions, and we're kind of coming up on the top of the hour. So I think what we'll do is we'll end here. I really appreciate my speakers, as not just for speaking, but also for helping to lead this group, because there's a lot of work that's going to be done. And I know these guys are up to the task, and we'll soon be seeing some very, very strong output out of the Sustainability Working Group. But also thank you all for joining this call. We'll be making a recording available to you after the fact. And I've also been asked if we could provide a copy of the slides. So I'll talk to the presenters later and see if we're all in agreement with that, and I'll let you know in that email. So I guess with that, thank you very much, and we'll end the recording and stop the call. Appreciate your being here.